why does this work? Why does this work? I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. There's a video project I've been working on for a very long while that's supposed to go into the origins of various Transformers characters, not in terms of lore, but in terms of how they were developed at Marvel, how they came into being when it comes to an editorial standpoint. And a thing that has been a tremendous help when it comes to a lot of these ideas that I've been having
is an essay that just got released on tfwiki.net by the user Broadside.
Broadside has posed a really interesting outlook on Transformers, a great way to divide the series up into two distinct categories. Budiansky versus Ferman. And you hear that, and you might take that as almost like a great divide of different fans, but it's actually a very engaging read, and a wonderful way to break down the franchise to its core elements, as diverse as they are. I'm going to post that link in the comments below, and I implore you, go give that a read, because Broadside was able to take big ideas that I, and I'm sure a lot of other fans have had in their heads for a long time, but just have not had the ability to crack the code on. I adore the article, and I'm going to be paraphrasing chunks of it here. So what does all this mean? Well, if you go back to Marvel and the original Transformers comic, there are two major writers that are associated with that ongoing series: Bob Budiansky and Simon Furman. Bob Budiansky was perhaps the single most important person to the development of Transformers as a story and as a cast of characters. Every single one of the 84 Autobots and Decepticons, the 85 Autobots and Decepticons, and the 86 Autobots and Decepticons were developed by him. He was the guy who handled all the toy bios. In many ways, Bob Budiansky was the man most responsible for giving life to these big robots. As for Simon Ferman, he was a writer at Marvel UK. Back in the day, Marvel had a different publishing house in the United Kingdom. That also meant that when they began the Transformers comic, there was going to be the US version and the UK version. The US version was a monthly comic book. The UK version was a bi-weekly comic book. That meant that Simon Furman got to add a whole lot of stuff and give entire new arcs and identities to a number of the characters. It also means that he was able to give his own perspective on the Transformers series. Towards the end of the US run, Ferman was brought to the main Marvel offices and made the main writer of the Transformers series. And indeed, Simon Ferman tends to get all the credit when it comes to the great stuff that Marvel did, even though a lot of the stuff people credit him with, honestly, was much more Budiansky's work. I want to make this abundantly clear right now. I am not taking sides as to who I think is a better writer between Simon Ferman or Bob Budiansky. I'm also not trying to give personal endorsements or condemnations towards either writer. This is much more just an easy way to make two broad categories. It helps to explain how they wrote the comics, and then how that's affected the entire franchise as a whole. Another way to look at this is Budiansky is robots in disguise, whereas Ferman is more than meets the eye. This is another thing that Broadside brought up, and is a beautiful way to give a more kind of zippy answer as to what's the difference. When Bob Budiansky wrote for the Marvel comic, it was from the perspective of the humans. Buster Witwicky was the real main character of the comic. The Transformers were an external thing, something he was learning about. Our observer character was another human. The thrust of the story had to deal with how the Transformers affect Earth, not the other way around. The Transformers were almost like this force of nature, and humans were having to deal with it. In a lot of ways, you could look at Budiansky's work almost in a similar vein to how we view Godzilla. It's not a story that follows Godzilla, it's a story about how Godzilla affects the things around him. That is the same way Budiansky viewed the Transformers. That also has to deal with the vehicle modes. He focused more on the fact that they were here in secret, that they were having to assimilate Earth culture. Many issues of his comic had to deal with the Transformers learning about TV shows, or movies, or even car washes. Budiansky's work tended to lean more towards, let's say, family-friendly. I personally would say optimistic. It was a little bit more like an adventure with comedy. Big, dashing heroes, interesting villains who were still very clearly the bad guy, even though some of them had sympathetic qualities, and we were along for the ride. In a lot of ways, if you want to figure out who inspired the G1 cartoon more, Seasons 1 and 2 of the G1 cartoon are very much in Budiansky's way of doing things, which is to say, we're not watching the robots by themselves. We are watching the robots and how they engage with a new planet, and we, the observer characters, are getting to see how they slowly learn more of Earth. If Budiansky gave us an adventure, Ferman gave us a war drama. He focused much more on the backstory of the Transformers. The stories had to do less with how they are interacting with Earth, and more just focused on them as the observer characters themselves. We did away with the humans towards the end of the Furman run, and if you want to see how that affected the cartoon, the movie in Season 3 delved more with the Autobots on their own. Even though Daniel Witwicky was there and he was supposed to take the Spike role, he wasn't always there. In fact, they kind of replaced him with another robot, Wheelie. With Simon Furman, there was always a little bit more of a cynical edge to things. There wasn't a lot of humor, and the humor that was there tended to be rather dark. He wanted to focus on Cybertron. He wanted to focus on the Cybertronians and how they are trying to end the war as quickly as they can. He also enjoyed dealing with non-traditional leaders. He loved Grimlock because Grimlock was not entirely squeaky clean. If you want to break it down a little bit further, you could almost say Budiansky was like the Silver Age of comics, in which it was a lot more supposed to be getting kids in the door having a good adventure. By contrast, Ferman would be a lot more like the Bronze Age of comic books that we saw in the 1990s. Which is better, which is worse, that's not my place to say. However, it was distinct, and you can find that many Transformers productions fall into one of two camps now. Similar to Budiansky, similar to Ferman. Just to crib a couple of examples from Broadside again, because again that essay is so good, please go read it. Cyberverse versus Earthspark. Cyberverse technically took place on Earth, until they dumped that in Season 3 because we only saw humans once or twice. They were always more focused on Bumblebee as the observer character. He was the character we, the audience, was supposed to relate to. It was entirely about the robots. And come Season 3, they embraced that entirely. The Quintessons became the main bad guys, we were on Cybertron. It worked really well. Cyberverse is one of my favorite renditions of Transformers from recent years, and it's because they found their niche. They became the ultimate example of a Furmanist style of Transformers writing. Focus on the bots, focus on the war, focus on their lore, their backstories, their personalities. Meanwhile, we can look at the most recent cartoon and the show that followed up Cyberverse, Earthspark. In Earthspark, the war is done. It focuses on the Transformers having to live here on Earth. Once again, they are robots in disguise. The Decepticons are on the run, essentially, from the government, whereas the Autobots are having to work within the government. The Terrans, the new generation of Transformers, are supposed to be the bridge between the final generation of Cybertron and the first new generation of Transformers that will all be born on Earth. There is much more a story of a merging of cultures, and understanding a cultural exchange between one planet to another. And you can see that in the family. The Mateo family is built on the idea of a mixed family. And I don't just mean mixed in terms of cultures, but mixed in terms of human and robot. And yet still one cohesive group that can learn from itself and can grow with each member providing their own piece of it. It's beautiful in that way. And it's something that Budiansky would have absolutely adored, considering he was the guy who came up with the idea of a Witwicky hanging out with a Bumblebee. Speaking of Bumblebee, why don't we talk about how the movies have done Furman writing versus Budiansky writing, with the Bumblebee movie being a beautiful example of Budiansky. Yes, you had the opening scene that was on Cybertron, but the main thrust of the movie is Bumblebee living with Charlie. Bumblebee having to assume a vehicle mode, Bumblebee learning what it's like to be on Earth, falling in love with human movies, learning to speak through the human radio. The whole story is about how Earthlings react to the Transformers, with the US government being duped by the Decepticons, and a genuine friendship between human and Transformer, ensuring that Shatter and Dropkick can't end the world. It is a comedic movie, it's adventurous, but it's also not attempting to be too earth-shattering. It's not attempting to ask any type of massive existential question. It's there so the audience can enjoy it. They can relate to the friendship between Charlie and Bumblebee, and they can even start to see themselves in this friendship. However, if you want a more Furman-style movie, Transformers 1 is here. Transformers 1 deals entirely with the backstory and lore of the Cybertronians. It goes into Primus, the 13 Primes, the origins of the Matrix. It goes into the importance of transformation cogs. It goes into the backstory of Orion Pax, Alita 1, B-127, D-16. It's entirely self-contained on Cybertron. The only aliens mentioned are the Quintessons. And even then, there is no question what the point of this is. The point is to focus on the robots, their struggles, their drama, and ultimately how Optimus becomes the leader of the Autobots. I know this is getting long in the tooth now, but there's one more example I want to add, and it's the first 2 Transformers shows I saw from front to back every episode. Animated versus Beast Machines. Beast Machines is perhaps the ultimate example of Furman-style writing, entirely taking place on Cybertron, with the only species you see being Cybertronians, Maximals, Predacons, Viacons. It is supposed to show you the final days of Cybertron as we know it. It delves into the origins of things like the Plasma Energy Chamber, the Cyber Planet Key, even the origins of the planet Cybertron itself, showing us that there was one point where it was an organic planet, which, by the way, is actually something that came from Budiansky, but that's beside the point. The entire point of Beast Machines was to show an entire series taking place on their planet. There is no human, there is no alien, there is no other. It is an internal conflict. In some ways, you can almost say that Beast Machines is a show about domestic policy. And as a result, it struggles. A big part of why Transformers works is the other. And then you got Animated. Animated is my favorite Transformers show. And it is the ultimate example of Budiansky writing. Animated was made with the idea that the Autobots aren't an army of aliens, they're superheroes. They have a base in Detroit. The vehicle modes are a way for them to be in disguise. And past that, most of Season 1 doesn't even have Decepticons. It's mostly the Autobots learning how to live on Earth. Sometimes that means that they're dealing with another Earthbound Transformer in the form of Megatron, but a lot of the time that means that they're fighting Earth villains. Villains like Meltdown, Nanosec. These guys are profiting off of Cybertronian technology. Again, the very core of this version of the story is how do humans and Transformers interact. Sorry Somedeck is our viewpoint into the Transformers world. We're able to learn about them through them teaching Sorry about their history and culture. But at the same time, Sorry is teaching them about Earth culture, how humans work, how birthdays work. All very childish things, but it's also really heartwarming. There's a lot of points where it's nice to see Optimus learn what a family is, or for Bulkhead and Bumblebee to learn what a birthday is. It goes back to what I was saying before. When you're choosing a Furman-style story, it's a drama. When you're choosing a Budiansky-style story, it's an adventure. An adventure where it's always going to end with the good guys prevailing and having a good laugh at the end. There are various exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, every Transformers continuity out there falls into one of those two camps. But then we get to something that mixes the two. IDW. And what do you know? Once again, you can divide it by Robots in Disguise and More Than Meets the Eye. Robots in Disguise was overseen by John Barber. With that, you can see the Autobots on Earth. You see Starscream, now the leader of Cybertron, trying to form a council of worlds. The others are now not only humans, but also Cybertronians that have not engaged with the Cybertronian Civil War. We now have two different ways to learn about the Transformer culture, and in turn, the Cybertronians are having to adapt. Yes, the Earthlings are now far more able to interact with Transformers, they even have weapons to use against them, and that becomes a threat. However, we also learn about the cultures of Caminus. We learn about the Jungle Planet. We learn about Velocitron. This is all done through the Council of Worlds, and specifically through the character of Windblade. In some ways, I think Windblade is the ultimate example of what Budiansky thought the Autobots should be. Windblade is idealistic. She's heroic. She is compassionate to a fault. She sees the good in things far too easily. At the same time, it works out. There are points in which maybe she gives people the wrong amount of trust, and it bites her. But at the same time, she was the only person to ever think that there was anything good in Starscream. And she was right. There was good in Starscream. Good that even he himself didn't see. And it was through her opening the door that Starscream was able to find his morality. And as a result, Windblade herself is made into the leader of Cybertron. Even though Optimus Prime is very much present in this story, he had lost almost all of his idealism. He was now much more proud than he was Optimus, and I'm not making exaggerations, that's literally the story. After Combiner Wars, he had a little too much prowl left in his processor. Whereas Windblade, she continued to be a good guy, squeaky clean even. But there is a much more important part of her. Besides just her morality, it was her willingness to learn from other cultures. Windblade was the one who oversaw the Council of Worlds. She was the one who reached out. She was the one who attempted to understand. And more importantly, she was the gateway for Caminus, her colony, to understand. If we were to say that Budiansky's story ultimately is a story of cultural exchange, Windblade's whole personality is that. The exchange of culture and the growth as a result. To the point that at the end of the Robots in Disguise story, which was seen in Optimus Prime, Till All Are One, and the Unicron story, we see what's left of all these planets coming together to form one good mixing pot of a society. All the colonies, Cybertron, Earth, and other alien worlds, all co-occupying one single ball in the middle of the universe. And they're happy. It ends on a very uplifting, positive note. There's a sense that maybe, just maybe, this is all going to work out. Of course, when you talk IDW 1.0, most people assume you're talking about More Than Meets the Eye. And for good reason. More Than Meets the Eye is a wonderful comic. But More Than Meets the Eye is entirely the robots. They occasionally talk about other aliens, but usually they're just there as incidentals. A way that you can have some type of opposition, or maybe a throwaway line here and there. The main point of the story is to follow the robots, and no one knew that better than James Roberts. Just like how I said Windblade is the ultimate example of a Budiansky character, I feel that James Roberts did the ultimate example of a Ferman character, and it's Megatron. His version of Megatron is steeped entirely in the lore, the history of the Transformers. The Functionalist Council, Cyber Utopia, the Knights of Cybertron, all these things connect back to Megatron in some way, shape, or form. There's also the fact that we delve into his personal traumas. We go into his regrets, his hopes. We see him change over time, but there's always this looming threat over him. The other Autobots don't appreciate him as an Autobot. There is always this rumbling in the background that everyone thinks that he's going to relapse. He himself thinks that he's going to relapse and turn evil again. And yet, he doesn't. But even when he has done everything he could to change, go into a different universe where he became their version of Optimus, giving hope to an entire people against their corrupt government, he's still not good enough to open the matrix of leadership at the end of the day. There is a steep cynicism in all of More Than Meets the Eye. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it's the reality. And the story ends with the entire cast of characters we've grown to love either dead or disenfranchised. The final issue takes place at Ratchet's funeral. We don't know what happens to Megatron. We can only assume that he was executed. Ultra Magnus has gone on. Drift is now without his partner. Rodimus, who has been our captivating main character, the captain of the Lost Light, he's just a washout. Someone who's jumping from ship to ship to try to capture the glory days again. If Windblade and their story ended on a hopeful note that we could do better, Rodimus' story, and by extent Megatron's story, it feels a lot more like a solemn idea. We're just going to die quietly, alone, and there's not going to be anyone there to really notice. That is a massive theme when you look at these two types of stories back to back. Budiansky is, by nature, far more optimistic in their writing than Furman is, and I'd go so far as to say there's always better endings attached to a Budiansky-style story. When I say better, I mean better for the characters, more hopeful. Just to go over the examples I provided. If you were to look at G1, Decepticons defeated, Autobots have Cybertron, and Earth is still completely okay. We also have new friends in the forms of the Nebulans. Awesome. Great. If we were to look at Earthspark, well, it ends with the family together. Hope. The Decepticons are off planet. Sure, they might come back, but that doesn't change the fact that the family is safe. If we were going to look at Bumblebee, it ends with the Autobots joining Bumblebee and Optimus on Earth. Charlie finishes rebuilding her dad's car. Everyone is still on their own life paths, but there's a sense that they're going to find home. And finally, if we were to again look at Transformers Animated, it ends with Megatron defeated, Decepticons rounded up, Optimus Prime is now wearing the Matrix of Leadership, what's left of the Allspark, and there's hope that, sure, Sentinel Prime is still a problem, there's still Decepticons out there, but clearly the people of Cybertron recognize Optimus as the better leader. And even more importantly, there's a chance that Earth and Cybertron are going to continue to co-develop, with Sorry as the bridge between them. Let's look at the Furman contemporaries. Cyberverse ends with them all still on a dying planet. Sure, the Autobot-Decepticon war is over, but there's always more external threats, interdimensional threats, interplanetary threats. Even though one particular fight is done, there's a sense that there's just more right around the corner, and they still haven't solved the problem as to what happens when they run out of juice. If we were to look at Transformers 1, the story ends with the Quintessons more than likely coming back, and we don't know what's going to happen there, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be anything too good. And if you were to stick around for the after-credits scene, the Decepticons are now fully militarized and ready to rise up against what Megatron is deeming the Age of Primes. And again, if we were to look at Beast Machines, Primal is dead. Megatron is dead. There is a new beginning to Cybertron, but there's also a sense that this isn't the end of the story. And indeed, in the Universe comics, there's just going to be Unicron to show up and his heralds. It seems as though, regardless of how they try to end a Furman story, those stories are always going to conclude in the most cynical way possible. Everyone loses. Even if we want to look at the stories that Furman had a direct hand in, this stays true. If we look at the G1 Marvel comic, they ended that in Regeneration 1. Regeneration 1 ends with everyone dead. There is new species growing on Cybertron, but no more Cybertronians themselves. The entire continuity's been cut off from the rest of the multiverse. If you want to go before that, we can check out G2, in which G-Axis has destroyed most all Cybertronians, and those that remain are so battle-damaged and so warlike that there's not going to be much to help anyone. According to the Beast Wars continuity, the Swarm is never defeated. It's going to destroy the entire planet Earth, and the Autobots will not be able to contain it until after the planet is doomed. Just to make a final cap on this, there is a final IDW story, Last Bot Standing. Last Bot Standing is not supposed to be the end of any one particular continuity, but to be fair, it really does read a lot like it's supposed to be the end of whatever continuity More Than Meets the Eye takes place in. And it ends with the Cybertronians have destroyed the entire universe. There's only one planet left with life. What few Decepticons and Autobots remain have formed one cannibalistic cabal that are literally jumping from planet to siphon every little piece of life left. And it ends with Rodimus killing most of them, putting the rest into stasis, and the Cybertronians going into space and just waiting it out until they all starve to death. When Furman is behind the wheel, or anyone who has taken inspiration from Furman, the story ends with, it didn't matter what side you were on. Weren't we all just rotten? Aren't we all just going to die? Is there ever really a true point to it? There's another happy accident, though. Furman stories end. They end definitively. Budiansky stories don't. Even the stories that are inspired by the Budiansky style, it's almost like it ends on a the adventure continues type of conclusion. Animated is that way. Earthspark is that way. Bumblebee is that way. Even the G1 cartoon is that way. And I think it's because, in a certain way, Budiansky writes in something truer to life than Furman does. A Furman-style story gets so caught up in the drama, so caught up in the need to examine these characters down to the final crumb, that they almost miss the point that there's so much in our lives that are not in our control. Not everything is a great machination from an outside threat. Not everything is just horrible war and bombs and fires everywhere. Sometimes you just get into a car crash. Sometimes it's quick. Sometimes it's an accident. In the need for drama, we've lost something true to life. And I'd also point this out. Furman stories attempt to tell the story that every sentient creature are, in their own way, evil. In their own way, a drag on the world around them. Again, a through line in every Furman-esque Transformers story is the Autobots and Decepticons alike will eventually cannibalize each other. This is something I really enjoy Budiansky's writing for. His stories don't end definitively. Yes, they're always very positive. It's more than likely the good guys are going to win eventually. But there's also just as much a chance things get worse after this. Or that everyone dies and then it gets worse just because generational drift happens. The thing I love about Budiansky is it feels real. It feels more true to life. This video is getting very long. I just adored this essay, and I adored the thoughts it inspired in me, so I wanted to record something. But there is exactly one more thing I would like to add, and that one thing is, when it comes to Transformers, there are two major ways to write Optimus Prime. Optimus Prime is either the legendary leader of the Autobots, or he was Orion Pax, and hoisted into leadership. I have long made my opinion clear, which I prefer. In our fandom, in our fiction, at the end of the day, I prefer an Optimus that wasn't a member of the 13 Primes. I prefer an Optimus that isn't somehow endowed with great purpose. I enjoy an Optimus that is optimistic. I enjoy an Optimus that Budiansky loved and Ferman hated. Maybe that's the reason why, as I've gotten older, I've grown to really enjoy the Budiansky style of Transformers fiction more so than the Ferman. And if you want to have an idea as to what one of our most popular pieces of fiction in Transformers is right now, a panel as benign as Optimus Prime stepping on a deer and feeling the weight of the world afterwards. That's straight out of Budiansky. It's only in a story about the cultural exchange and about the coming together of man and machine that you can get a moment in which Optimus Prime sees the fragility of life. Budiansky's stories embrace the idea of change. They embrace the idea of diversity. They embrace the idea of how sometimes we might be in a world not made for us. And instead of trying to change it, we need to learn to find the middle point between what we are, what it is, and what we can be together. In a Furman story, it's isolationist. It's entirely self-contained. Perhaps that's where the cynicism comes from. They don't change. Despite being more than meets the eye, they forget that at the core of every transformer is the ability to transform, not just physically, but in terms of who and what they are.
Again, I want to make the point clear that these styles of writings do not reflect any of the views of the people writing them. However, there is a distinct difference between how does a Budiansky story view the world compared to a Furman story. If something doesn't make sense to a character in a Furman story, it is almost immediately seen as wrong, or something that needs to be changed. That can even be seen with the character of R.C. Simon Ferman, the writer, didn't see the point in having a female character, so instead of trying to embrace something new or trying a new idea, he turned into a joke, a way to specifically target groups he didn't enjoy. Even when he tried to rectify this later on in IDW, it became a problem in a whole other way, entirely because he can't see the reason as to why there would be Transformers with gender. It's that lack of ability to soften your stance or to take in a different viewpoint that permeates a Furman-style story. It is a matter of one person against the world. Dig in your heels and say, the world is wrong. And yet, every now and again, you wonder what happens when you're wrong. What happens when you have the moment and you realize that you made the mistake? That's something that is very rarely explored in a Furman-esque story, because so many of these types of Transformers tales focus on the planet Cybertron defending itself from the other, the outside, the different, be it the Quintessons, or the Viacons, or some extremist group of Decepticons. There's no attempt to understand nor empathize, only defend, and by defending, ultimately attacking. In a Budiansky-style story, it is a story of empathy, an empathy to see why the different exists, and wondering, could your life be better by taking aspects of the different or the new, or to change your worldview? When Budiansky writes the Autobots, they are a group of scientists, explorers, artists, and philosophers. They exist to understand the universe around them, but not change it. Learn from it. At the end of the day, you must make a decision in your own personal viewpoint. Either the world is something to hold out against or to learn from. Other cultures are something to resist or take pieces from. There is no right or wrong answer. It is ultimately a discussion of your own personal viewpoint. But that also means that our two great forms of Transformers storytelling also share that dichotomy. It is either a story of all of us together in this great big world, or us versus them. Bob Budiansky and Simon Ferman, these two gave us so many tools to utilize in storytelling. And without them, Transformers would never be able to exist in the way it does. Past that, it is your decision as to which one you prefer. It is your life and your perspective that will affect which storytelling method you enjoy seeing more. But as for me and where I am in my life, I think I'm much more a Budiansky kind of guy. But hey, that's just me.
The golden age of Cybertron has come again, Cerebros. Thanks to you and Spike. You don't have to fight anymore.
But what of the Decepticons?
There may always be Decepticons. But I have a different task for you, and your people must learn how to be masters of their own fate. Cerebros, when the last of the Hive's evil is wiped out, you shall live here in peace.
It's a miracle.